Welcome to Cheese Media, a place where I, Kieran, like to talk about the things that I like to talk about, namely culture, politics, how we all live in a society, and of course, cheese. I've called it Cheese Media because I like cheese, and really that's all there is to it. This is Lula. She's my trusty pug friend, and she's my main researcher. Thanks for all your hard work, Lula. This is going to be a great video. Now, this time around we're going to be wading into the murky depths of Nietzschean philosophy, looking at some of his most important and influential ideas and theories, and comparing them to the 1998 movie, The Truman Show. A quick heads up here, Nietzsche as a person was quite complicated. A lot of his ideas don't translate very well into our modern political times. He's been historically associated with the Nazis, and in recent times the alt-right have tried to lay claim to him. But of course, as always, the truth is actually a little bit more complicated than the right might have you believe. So I wanted to start today by trying to clear up some of the things that people tend to misunderstand or exaggerate about Nietzsche.
Wasn't Nietzsche anti-Semitic?
Well, as it turns out, not really. He actually hated anti-Semites. He declared, in fact, that he'd like to have them all shot. So no, that's not right that he hated anti-Semites. Unfortunately, his sister was a complete and utter Nazi. When he suffered a mental breakdown in 1899, his sister took charge of his care. He was dead within a year and she went on to live for another 35, and in the meanwhile played absolute havoc with his writing, chopping and changing things, taking things out, and adding things in that he never necessarily intended to be there. Now, that said, when you do learn about some of his philosophies, you can see why Nazis might actually be drawn to some of his ideas. He was very admiring of people who were strong, who had strength, and who were prepared to go to whatever lengths they deemed necessary in order to hold on to their power.
Didn't Nietzsche hate women?
Okay, well this one's a bit more complex. On the one hand, he voted at Basel University to allow for the admission of women, and he was one of the very few people to do so. He was friends with a number of well-known feminists and suffragettes of his day as well, and supported them. However, on the other hand, he did write in his diary that he was against giving women the vote. So I would say that there's definitely he's a bit of a mixed bag on this one. He wasn't great about women. The thing about Nietzsche is, on the whole, his whole thing was about questioning mainstream theories, philosophies and assumptions. If you want to learn more about him, I've linked some articles below. I can also really strongly suggest the videos by PhilosophyTube. They're just fantastic, and they really help you get an understanding of him as a person and also some of his philosophies. Now guys, spoiler warning. As well as some philosophical theories that are over 100 years old, we're also going to be talking about a movie which is over 25 years old. So if you haven't seen it and for whatever reason you happen to watch this video and it gets spoiled for you, well then that would be completely reasonable for you to come after me and complain to me about that, wouldn't it? So yeah, you just go ahead and do that, that's fine. Seriously though, I should probably say it's actually a really, really good movie and I would highly recommend to go and watch it now. Go and watch it even if you're going to watch the rest of this video anyway and then complain. Just go and watch the movie because it's actually really good. The Truman Show stars Jim Carrey, Laura Linney and Ed Wood, and it was directed by Peter Weir and written by Andrew Niccol. It's about a man named Truman, who on the face of it lives a great life. He lives in a picturesque town of friendly people, he has a steady job, and he's married to a beautiful woman. There's no crime to speak of, the sun is always shining, and people are always in a good mood. The only problem is that the entire town is fake, and apart from Truman, everyone is really an actor. And I've noticed from a lot of the actors that surround Truman, whether they be people close to him, such as his wife or his mother, or even just some of the minor characters and extras, is that they appear to have this undercurrent of repressed rage. It's as if for perhaps years they've been presenting themselves as outwardly friendly towards him, but just bubbling beneath the surface is a roiling sea of resentment and contempt. Truman is the star of the most popular TV show on Earth. Every second of his life, from conception onwards, has been captured by cameras hidden in the world around him. In fact, as you watch the movie, you'll notice camera lenses are built into everyday objects, such as his trash can and the fence posts that line his street. The set for an entire town has been constructed and populated with performers, including his parents, his best friend, and his wife. The only one who isn't aware of this, or at least isn't supposed to be, is Truman himself. As Truman begins to notice things around him aren't quite right, he starts to question his reality and test the boundaries of the fictional world around him. Everything in Truman's world is controlled by the show's creator, Christoph, who observes him from on high from behind the sun and moon of this enclosed world.
Christoph is the person who came up with the whole idea, and he functions as the director or the showrunner of the show. He watches Truman on cameras and is extremely possessive and ruthlessly controlling of all aspects of Truman's life. For example, he keeps Truman contained by having the town exist on an island, and installs a fear in him early on in his life of open water. Christoph is intolerant of those who try to tell Truman the truth of his life, and yet he also feels a great deal of fatherly-type love towards Truman. He justifies his creation by saying that he has created a perfect world for Truman, and he responds to criticism that it is the world outside of the TV set that is sick and wrong. Eventually, Truman overcomes his fear of open water, and he outwits Christoph, sailing to the edge of his world until he literally collides with its walls. The film ends with Truman defying Christoph, leaving his artificial world and stepping into the real one.
The premise of the film is something that seems to resonate with a lot of people, so much so that there actually is an illness, a condition known as the Truman Show delusion, where people do believe that everyone around them is somehow false or in on some kind of performance that they're not fully aware of. And I remember as a child, I had this sort of fantasy that everyone around me was secretly monsters. I think it really relates back to that childhood idea of being the centre of the universe, and as we grow up and we realise that idea isn't actually the truth, it becomes a bit of a battle in our heads. Now, I do like to think that I'm neither a narcissist or a paranoid schizophrenic. It's just something that I like to believe about myself. I think this is a film that speaks to a lot of people, even if they aren't convinced of that delusion. After all, who doesn't occasionally feel like our lives are being controlled by people that are just out of view? You know, most of us wouldn't choose to have the jobs that we have. Most of us would choose to live in nicer homes. A lot of people would choose not to hide their sexual or gender identity from the rest of the world for fear of persecution. And a lot of us would choose not to pay taxes used by governments to perpetuate genocide and bomb the poorest countries on earth. You know, that's just my point of view on that. A lot of us are told that when we grow up, we'll marry someone of the opposite sex, we'll have some kids, we'll work a boring office job, and not long after we retire, we'll die. And a lot of us wouldn't choose that kind of life.
Truman didn't choose to have his life limited to one small town. He wanted to be an explorer, not an insurance salesman. He didn't even really seem to be in love with his wife. At every turn, he was just sort of railroaded onto the next step by those around him, irregardless of how he actually felt. And of course, the moment he chooses to really start questioning and challenging this, the world around him seems to erupt into violence. I think, like a lot of people, my favourite sequence of the entire film is Truman on the boat at the very end, because this is where we get to see him make the choice to step through a door that was never intended for him. And by doing so, Truman finally takes control of his life, in utter defiance of not just those around him, not even just a stormy sea, but of the godlike figure who defines his entire existence.
In his essay, Truth and Lie in the Extramoral Sense, Nietzsche writes that truths are illusions, that we've forgotten our illusions. Now, he points out that the example of a leaf. Obviously, we've got a plant here. I don't want to go outside and get some leaves, okay? So I've got 2 plants. I've got props today. Now, Nietzsche uses the example of the leaf. Now, you can see here we've got a plant with some fairly standard looking leaves, right? And then we've got a spider plant here where the leaves look very different. However, we have a concept of the leaf. And that comes from the word leaf. It ties in different things about the leaves that they do have in common, for example, their biological purpose, to create the concept of what a leaf is. And yet there are these myriad differences between leaves, sometimes not just in shape and form and colour, but also, yes, in function too. And yet they get dismissed so that we can have this coherent concept of the leaf. So in a sense, what humanity has done is we've decided what a leaf is, and we have dismissed all the inconvenient differences that don't really fit inside that paradigm. And as Nietzsche goes on to point out, this is basically true of all words. For example, we could take 2 different pencils. One has rubber, one doesn't. One's green, one's orange and has zebras on. One's got black bit. What do you call that bit? The bit that isn't the lead, but there's the wood bit? Where the pencil shavings come from. I don't know what that's called. This other one's got the more standard pencil variety, the original flavour pencil. And yet, of course, both these things are pencils. The word becomes a concept, and the concept becomes, to us, the truth.
So we can see some of this quite clearly in The Truman Show. Marlon, Truman's best friend, says early on that nothing is fake, it's merely controlled. But this is clearly not true. Everything is fake in this world. The only authentic person is Truman, and even then we can see that Truman is not presenting himself authentically. He's steeped in resentment. In many ways, he and Meryl are mirror images of each other. Both are projecting sickly sweet happiness on the outside, and seething with rage and resentment just beneath the surface. Having seen this film many times now, I've got this sense that Truman might well already have quite a developed understanding that something is deeply wrong with the world around him. In fact, I think it's the creators of the show that are deluded, particularly Christoph, who's created this false world which he values much more than the real one.
In his book on the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche interrogates It's actually a really, really well-titled book because it's about the sort of genealogy of morality. Basically, he traces the origins of morality as he sees it and traces it through the ages. Now, it all starts, he theorises, with master morality. This is the idea that the good was associated with power. Those who could dominate and subjugate others were the good, and the subjugated, the weak, were the bad. Now, Nietzsche theorises that the bad, the weak, resented the good. Now, there was a third group, known as the priests. So it was this guy. This third group sees an opening for power in this resentment that the weak have. They start to teach the weak that the meek shall inherit the earth. The slaves, the weak, they revolt and they bring the masters down. And then who takes over? The priests. The priests have now replaced the masters as the drivers of society. Judeo-Christian morality, or slave morality as Nietzsche terms it, is founded in opposition to master morality. Being meek and complacent, knowing our place and staying in it are now seen as virtues. So then, what happens after this? What follows this new morality? Well, in Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, he makes probably what is his most famous claim. The main character, Zarathustra, comes down from the mountains where he's been enlightened through suffering or whatever, and he declares, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him.
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
Okay, that wasn't Nietzsche, that was actually Arnold Schwarzenegger, but it is easy to confuse the two. Now, the statement, God is dead and we have killed him, isn't to be taken literally. Nietzsche was an atheist. He didn't believe in God and therefore didn't believe that there was a God that could be killed. In his theory, Christianity has played its part. It's no longer really required to be the backbone of society. It's become defunct. Therefore, God is dead and we have killed him. And this makes sense when you look at the time that Nietzsche was writing, and it was really the height of the Enlightenment, and Western society was turning away from religion. More and more it was turning away from religion and towards science, towards facts and knowledge. But as you'll notice, Zarathustra wasn't necessarily talking about, well, we should all learn facts and become very knowledgeable. This was someone who found their enlightenment through suffering. And this brings us on to the concept of the Übermensch. Übermensch is often translated into Superman, but this is somewhat misleading. Also, thanks to his pesky Nazi sister, it's also confused with a lot of Aryan ideals, but it's not that either. A better translation would be Overman. The Übermensch, or the Overman, is Nietzsche's solution to what comes next for humanity. The Übermensch ushers in the next stage of the evolution of morality. So what you can see here is that Nietzsche's not the Christianity's biggest fan. In fact, in general, he wasn't a big fan of religion, but he did see its value in that it had been something that had really shaped and driven society. It had instilled a certain set of morals, and that had helped us to create and to coexist and evolve. Now he's saying, basically, humanity, we've been there, we've done that, we've got the Christianity t-shirt, and now it's time to move on. And that's what the Übermensch is really about. It's all about that moving on from Christianity. It's about looking at all that and saying, sod that, actually, I'm going to come up with my own morals. I'm going to come up with my own system of values and morals based on my everyday, day-to-day life. Quick side note here, I should mention that Nietzsche doesn't offer any kind of citation or evidence for any of this at all. He kind of just says that this is what has happened and is going to happen. And also he does appear to have been wrong. Yes, Western society has continued to move away from Christianity, that's definitely true. Less and less people identify as Christian in Great Britain, for example. But its influence on our cultural norms and values, they kind of have stayed. And yes, it's true, we are gradually moving away from Christianity and Christian morals over time. But you'll notice that it's not quite as dramatic as Nietzsche imagines. Some Ubersmensch hasn't come along and formed a whole new set of values and morals and sort of led the way for the rest of us.
If you pay a particular attention to what Truman's wearing throughout the film, you'll notice that early on he's wearing these really ridiculous outfits. There's this one scene of him in the garden in his shorts, and it makes him look really childish. But in that wonderful final scene, he's wearing the sweater and trousers. He looks like an adult. I think this is symbolic of his transformation, of his growing into his own authentic self. We should also note that Christoph removes Truman's father from the narrative quite early on. Now, this could come from a sense of jealousy. Maybe Christoph feels the need to be Truman's father figure, and he feels the need to keep Truman suppressed in a malleable childlike state. Truman rebelling and questioning his reality is very teenager-like, and his decision to step through the door, to use his own judgment rather than that of his so-called parent, is also symbolic of him stepping into his adulthood. He now has the ability to shape his own reality with far greater freedom. Now, it doesn't take an expert to notice that the final scene has a lot of biblical imagery. We've got the stormy sea, we've got Christoph's voice emanating from the sun. He's talking to Truman about the perfect world he's created for him. On the sails of Truman's boat there's the number 139, which could be a reference to Psalm 139, which ruminates on the omniscience of God, extending not just to people's external lives, but also their thoughts and internal motivations. And the scene does draw attention to the fact that Christoph has been fooling himself into thinking he understands how Truman thinks and feels better than Truman does himself. The dome in which Sea Haven exists is Christoph's version of Eden. It's a perfect world in his view, lacking the sickness of the real world. Christopher Bingham, in his podcast about the movie called Trutalk, designates Truman as Adam in this allegory. But I think that Truman is actually much more like Eve. He's given the choice between staying ignorant or pushing to find the truth of his reality, and he chooses the latter. So for me, the door he steps through is representative of the apple of knowledge, and crucially, unlike in the Bible, this is actually depicted as a positive moment.
So, you can see how it all ties together here. True man rejecting the fake world that Christ has built for him and steps through the doorway. He's becoming an Ubersmensch. Through Truman's example, we can see the liberating power of asserting ourselves, of standing up to that higher power and saying, actually, this is my truth and I'll stick to it, thank you very much. Only, sort of less British than that. Because there is a glaring danger here. It'd be easy for someone to take this argument and, I don't know, go up into a tower and start shooting people and say something like, world is full of demon lizard people, so what I'm going to do is shoot them all, and that's my truth, thank you very much, so don't try and tell me otherwise. And just to be clear for all you legal teams and lawyers out there, I'm saying don't do that. Now, Nietzsche does address this in his theory of perspectivism. He argues that basically it's impossible for anyone to take an objective view of something because we all assume a perspective. For example, if we come back to the priests, a different kind of pencil. Now, to me, and to you, the pencil looks very much like this. But to little man here, the pencil looks, well, very different. It's more like this. So, it's safe to say we all have different perspectives on the pencil, but whose perspective is the right one? Whose perspective is the objective one? Well, the answer is none of ours. So then this presents a problem. How do we get an objective understanding of an object? After all, if we were to abandon any perspectives, there's nothing to see. So, what does Nietzsche say about this? Particularly as knowers, let us not be ungrateful towards such resolute reversals of the familiar perspectives and valuations with which the spirit has raged against itself all too long. To see differently in this way, for once, to want to see differently, is no small discipline. So, what Nietzsche is arguing here is that we should build on our own perspective by communicating with others, by taking my perspective and someone else's. We can get a more rounded idea of what the pencil looks like to each other and therefore what the pencil is. The crucial thing to remember here is we can't pin down what the objective truth is, but we can form an idea and we can build a shared understanding. Nietzsche says, there is only perspectival seeing, only a perspectival knowing, and the more effects we allow to speak to about a matter, the more eyes, different eyes, we know how to bring to bear on one and the same matter, that much more complete will be our concept of this matter, our objectivity be. And the thing is if we ignore everyone else's perspective and just kind of stick to our own, well, that's just kind of rubbish behaviour really, isn't it? After all, as I say in my intro, we all live in a society. It's all very well to look at things from your perspective and tell your truth, but if in doing that it means that you're ignoring someone else's point of view or directly contradicting it or telling them that it's not true, you're trying to tell someone else's story for them. You're setting yourself to become a sort of antagonist to that person.
As I mentioned earlier, Christoph makes the assumption that he can take on an objective position, assuming this godlike role of being all-knowing, of having a subjective view of Truman. Christoph overlooks that he has a single perspective just like everyone else. After all, he can only observe his screens through his own eyes. In fact, his so-called objectivity is shown to be false towards the end of the film when Truman is able to outsmart him.
I think what's so captivating and relevant about the ideas of the Übermensch and Perspectivism is that when we look at them in a more metaphorical sense, they're really just about questioning the assumptions that are there as a result of societal pressure. They can be seen as a moment of someone who's realising their true gender identity or their queerness. They can be seen as that moment when we go, actually, this job isn't for me. It can be that moment when we liberate ourselves from a relationship that deep down we knew was making us miserable. Or when we let go of that toxic political or social idea we've been clinging onto for so long. Because in these moments we change and we grow in fundamental ways, and we gain, while not an objective perspective of how things really are, a much, much clearer picture of how they might just be. So, that is Nietzsche in a nutshell, though he would question, is it actually a nutshell? Maybe we should be calling it something else. But thank you for watching today's video. If you did enjoy, please like and subscribe. As I said earlier, I'd really highly recommend watching the movie The Truman Show. If you haven't seen it, or if you've not seen it for a long time, it's a really, really great movie. And maybe you'll have a different perspective on the movie now you've watched this video. And in case I don't see you, have a good evening. Have a good morning, tomorrow morning, and I'll see you later.